Good afternoon. Before I start, we do need, for safety reasons, to keep the aisleways clear, so I would appreciate if you would do that. This is the last in the series of symposia or discussions we've had on the Apollo program. And I would say this is probably the one of the momentous events we've had. It is such an honor for me today to have the group of people here on the platform. They've been the people that have made it happen. They've been our neighbors, our friends, and they're going to tell you a very interesting story. And I'm just so pleased to have you all here today and have them here today. And I want to express my appreciation to you all for coming. Let me introduce them. There's Frank Borman. I'm going to forget about this gentleman for a minute, but Frank Borman, Apollo 8. Gene Cernan, Apollo 10 and 17. Mike Collins, Apollo 11. Al Bean, Apollo 12. Jim Lovell, Apollo 13. Al Shepard, Apollo 14. Jim Irwin, Apollo 15. And John Young, Apollo 16. The moderator is going to be Jim McDivitt, Apollo 9. Jim used to be my boss when I was in the Apollo Project Office. So I'm introducing my boss, who was the head of the Apollo Spacecraft Project Office, and let's give him a welcome. He's going to be the moderator, Jim McDivitt.
Thank you, Aaron. Nobody could be Aaron's boss, except Ruth, and I know she's his boss. I have a very difficult job today trying to moderate. That means that you're supposed to somehow or other imply that you're in control of what's going on, and having worked with these guys before, I know that's an impossible task. I also know this may not be the most dignified symposium that anyone's ever been to before, so I will try to give it a little dignity at the beginning, and then we'll turn these guys loose. I'd like to sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, and that's the Apollo program and how we got to the moon and what we did when we got there. I suppose if you look back in history, you can find that probably the most generally accepted recorded effort of a political organization to use rocketry was probably in the 13th century at a place on the Yellow River called Kai Fung Fu, when the Chinese drove off the Mongols by shooting flaming petroleum products at them that were on a small rocket. But I think the real place to start on our journey today is probably on July 29, 1955, when President Eisenhower announced that there was going to be a project called Vanguard, whose objective was to stick a satellite in orbit around the Earth. It's to be an American project. Hopefully it would come to fruition in the year 1957, which was the International Geophysical Year. And everything looked fine, and we started this project. It was assigned to the Navy, and it was going along, a fairly complex rocket system. Unfortunately, we forgot that there were other people in the world, and that year happened to be the 100th anniversary of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was the father of rocketry in the Soviet Union. His birthday happened to be on September 17th. The Soviets, along the way, indicated in a number of articles that were written that they too thought they could put a satellite in orbit around the United States. And by the spring of 1957, were making a lot of noises like they were going to do it very quickly. We continued on with the Vanguard program, not apparently hurrying very much. And unfortunately, shortly after Tsiolkovsky's birthday on September 17th, October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. They launched another one the next month in November. We had a major failure on Vanguard in November and another one in December, And the leadership in the country finally decided that we ought to do something more dramatic, turn the Army loose, and beginning early in December, they put together the Jupiter-C rocket, which they launched on January 31st, 2 months after they started. There's a moral in that story in that we were farsighted enough to know that we could technically do something, but we weren't astute enough to know that politically and from a public relations standpoint, international relations standpoint, we ought to put some effort behind it and do it. In contrast with that, President Kennedy, on May 25th, 1961, announced that we're going to go to the moon in that decade. That only lasted about 8.5 years, and his entire basis for that was Al Shepard's flight, which had occurred about 20 days earlier, and Yuri Gagarin's flight that had occurred about a month earlier than that. So he got out there, made a commitment with very little background information, data to go on, but he put the effort behind it. The idea that you need the effort along with being farsighted is very important, and we shouldn't all forget that. We got through Gemini in the latter part of 1966, and we were about ready to fly Apollo in January 1967 when we had the fire at the Cape and lost 3 of our friends. That delayed the program for about 18 months, which really put a tight squeeze on getting to the moon by the end of the decade. When we finished Gemini then, we had a lot of knowledge, but we still didn't have that hardware. We finally started flying in October of 1968 with Apollo 7. We then flew in December, March, May, and July, and we're on the moon. We got there because there were a certain amount of pre-planning that had to go into that achievement, the ultimate goal, the landing on the moon. We did all that planning ahead of time, and we categorized those missions with letters: C, D, E, F, G. G was the lunar landing. Today we're going to talk about some of the missions that led up to there, and then we'll talk about how we explored the moon. I'll mention Apollo 7 since the crew isn't here. That was the C mission. The objective of that was to take off and fly around the Earth long enough to get some experience in the command and service module. They accomplished that very well, and we were able to go on then to Apollo 8. Apollo 8, by the way, was a sort of a fill-in because we were having spacecraft problems and a lot of other things, and it didn't have a letter associated with it. Apollo 9 was the DE mission, Apollo 10 was the F mission, and Apollo 11 the G mission. I'd like to have Frank come up now and talk to us about what he did on Apollo 8.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great for all of us old-timers to be back here today and to remember really a unique period in American history. We were all very fortunate. We had a mandate, we had the willing support of the Congress and of the people, and we had an enormously successful and dedicated organization. I think it's appropriate that we might just remember, because in all of the hoopla, and it's been this way from time immemorial, and I'm sure it will be this way for the rest of the manned spaceflight, the attention focuses on the astronauts. In reality, though, there were people like Jim Webb who really built NASA into the organization that it was. If there's ever an American that deserves a Medal of Freedom, and I hope that somebody's listening, Jim Webb should be awarded it. You go on down the line, the old people from NACA that stood in there, that had the knowledge, that worked night and day to make this thing work. All of us here owe a great deal of gratitude to the people that were left behind. And I mention that because that's particularly true of Apollo 8. We were, incidentally, Jim Lovell was my companion on Apollo 8, and I'd also like to introduce Bill Anders, who's down. Bill, would you stand up, because he was with us too. Stand up so everybody can see you. I apologize that he's dressed so casually. If he was still a member of the crew, he'd have a coat and tie on, but I don't have any control over him anymore. We were, as Jim pointed out, in Apollo 8 originally constrained or designed to fly an Earth orbital mission with a lunar module. That was changed abruptly in August of '68 when the 3 of us were at the Downey at the Apollo factory, North American factory, and I got a call, I believe it was on a Sunday, from Deke Slayton, who said, "Come back here right away. We want to talk to you about a different mission." At that point, I learned that we knew the lunar lander had slipped for our mission dramatically, and we were told that they were considering, I think they called it the E-Prime, wasn't it? Or the E-Prime mission, which would be a long way out, and then somebody had said, well, if we're going out 2,000 miles, why don't we go to the moon? And Slayton asked me if I would be interested in taking on that particular mission of going to the moon. I didn't have a chance to consult with Jim Lovell and Bill Anders, but they were as anxious as I was, and so we said yes. And from that moment on, our training and our total interest was on going to the moon. But behind the scenes, there were a lot of people that were making decisions. Tom Paine made some courageous decisions because, after all, whether we went or not would depend upon Apollo 7. Nobody had ridden the Saturn V before, so there were a lot of ifs, ands, and buts about that. We really didn't know what we were going to do because this had not been one of the planned mission. And we sat. This is the example of NASA at that day, in that day and age. Chris Kraft, one of the giants of the entire manned space program, called me over to his office. And we had Bill Tyndall, as I recall, and somebody else, and we sat there from about 1 till 5 o'clock and worked out the basic flight plan for Apollo 8. I don't know how long it would take NASA to do it today, but I suspect it would be more like 5 months than 5 hours. In any event, we got the basic decisions made at that point, and one of the other exciting or funny things that McDivitt didn't think was so funny, in the switch we had to take his spacecraft. And you would have thought that that spacecraft was his lifeblood, because he bitched like mad that he was going to lose his spacecraft. And there was no way that you could convince him that our spacecraft had been just as well prepared and just as well built as his was. But anyway, we ended up with a mission to go to the moon, circle it 10 times, and come home. I was fortunate not only to have the dedication of the ground people, but to have just 2 wonderful guys to work with. There was a lot of stress, and training in 4 months was not an easy task to turn around. But I would be less than remiss if I told you that we really had a lot of trouble. 400,000 Americans did their job well. It turned out exactly as we had scheduled. And one morning, one very cold morning, and I never would. Not only was this a cold morning, but the dear people at Kennedy, in addition to the coldness of the atmosphere, had somehow, I think, designed to put liquid oxygen in our suits because it was just very, very cold. They added to it with it. But we took off. We flew for 3 days. Remember now, this was the first time that man had been on the Saturn V, and I'll be honest with you, I did not really believe that we would be able to go to the moon. We would be able to commit to the moon on this particular mission. How many times do things go right the first time in modern America? Not many times. My particular concern at this point was that were it to go wrong, in other words, if we had a problem that would not allow us to commit to go to the moon, we would spend 2 weeks in Earth orbit. That was our alternate mission. Now, I'd already done that in Gemini 7 with Jim Lovell. And, you know, that was smaller than the Apollo, but I did not want to spend 2 weeks in Earth orbit with 2 sailors. I can tell you that now. Once was enough. In any event, over Hawaii, at the exact moment we were supposed to launch, we went. Everything went well. I managed to get sick. I guess it was the first case of spatial sickness or whatever you call it. I threw up for a little while, but we decided the doctors didn't need to know about it, and went on from there. I got well, and we went on then to approach the moon. And again, I wish I could tell you the enormous pride that I had when we were on the back side of the moon, the far side of the moon, at the exact millisecond that we were supposed to see lunar sunrise, which would indicate that we were in the proper orbit. We saw it. Now, that was, again, a tribute to the people that made it work. And boy, there were a lot of them, and a lot of the leadership was dynamic, and it was really great. I want to tell you, because you look like most of you are taxpayers, you got your money's worth from Apollo 8 for the first 5 or 6 orbits. After that, we were dead tired, and we were focused more on the Earth that you see in the backdrop here. The Earth became a great attraction. As a matter of fact, I suspect we didn't bring back any rocks. About the only thing that we brought back that you can remember was the picture of the Earth. There's a great dispute in the crew about who took that picture. I'll tell you the true story. I saw that Earth, and I woke. Anders was sleeping, if you can imagine that, going to the moon and sleeping. I woke him up and I said, Bill, take that picture. That's the one everyone will remember. And he said, I can't. I said, why not? He said, I don't have enough film. All my film is allocated for scientific purposes, and that's a PR shot. That's my story, and I'm going to stick to it. I want you to know that. Actually, I would suggest to you that there's a slight possibility that Anders may have taken that picture. We flew for 10 times. Perhaps one of the only other memorable thing about Apollo 8 was reading from the Bible, because it was Christmas Eve. We had been instructed sometime before the launch that we would be indeed circling the moon with a television exposure at that time, and we were told to do something appropriate. Those were the exact words. I've always thought this was a great tribute to this country to allow this forum to influence and propagandize the Earth and then tell the crew to do something appropriate. We searched around and discussed, and finally, at a suggestion of a friend, read from the first 10 verses of Genesis, and it seemed to be perfectly appropriate, because the moon, from our vantage point of 60 miles, was a desolate, God-forsaken place that these other gentlemen will tell you about because they had the opportunity to visit it. All in all, on Apollo 8, for me, was a remarkable experience. The dedication and the friendship of Bill and Jim has meant a great deal to me over the years. Perhaps the overriding consideration was of a society and a country that was working hell-bent to lever to achieve a mission that, if we think back now, was really unachievable. But we did it. We owe a great deal to the people of NASA and to the rest of you who paid your taxes to support it. Thank you very much.
Frank's in trouble. Lovell's going to talk after. And I think Bill wants some time, too. I'd like to talk about Apollo 9 for just a few minutes now. As I mentioned earlier, we had Apollo 7, which was a C mission to make sure that everything worked on a command and service module. We moved this E prime mission up in front of D. D sort of had the responsibility for D and E, and it was going to be followed by F and G, we'd hope. We had a flight patch, which took a long time to design. That's probably the most difficult part of the whole flight, is designing your flight patch. Then we had the 3 best-looking guys that ever flew. Next slide. Next slide. Well, I'm going to prove it here in a minute. There they are. Isn't that a good-looking bunch? We were heavy on photography in our flight. Next slide, please. We had a nice rocket. Everybody had a nice rocket. Next slide. This is a really. We had an EVA. We had red helmets on this one. The next one, please. Shows Dave with a red helmet. I was talking to Rusty yesterday, trying to figure out why they had red helmets. We didn't know. Does anybody here know why we had red helmets? Then these are the really good ones. Next slide, please. See, we didn't want to go to the moon and have that sort of nothing background there. We wanted to have the Earth behind our lunar module. And that's the only one that you'll see with the Earth behind it. Then we had the command module the same way. Next one, please. Isn't that beautiful? A lot better with those clouds in the background. The Hollywood part. And then the next slide. there are two things that are of really great consequence that happened on Apollo 9, I think. One is that we got to name the spacecraft. If you go back into the days of Mercury, all of the Mercury spacecraft were named Friendship 7, Faith 7, something 7. And then on Gemini, the first flight, Gemini 3, Gus and John wanted to name their spacecraft Unsinkable Molly Brown. So Dr. George Miller was adamant against naming spacecraft. After Mercury, they were going to be called Gemini 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But John and Gus had this deal worked out, and they told George Miller that they wouldn't possibly call their spacecraft anything except Gemini 3, and they didn't until about 3 or 4 seconds after liftoff. During which time, until it landed, it was known as Molly Brown. So I was coming up next, and Ed and I had this really grandiose name called the American Eagle for Gemini 4, and he wouldn't allow that. As a matter of fact, I guess his threats were more effective with respect to Ed and me, so we didn't name our spacecraft. But by the time we got to Apollo 9, we had 2 spacecraft. And Miller visited us down at the Cape one time, and we were using the names that we had picked, Gumdrop and Spider, and he insisted that we not use those names. So I said, okay. Said, stand by a minute. So I got out of the spacecraft, made a phone call to Houston, and talked to Dave, and then we conducted the rest of the mission where we were Apollo 9. And every time Houston made a call to us, we'd both answer, and we had the thing so screwed up in about 10 minutes that even George Miller relented, so we got to call our spacecraft with a name again. Now, I want to tell you that the guys on Apollo 9 weren't big thinkers, because we call our spacecraft Gumdrop and Spider, because they look like a gumdrop and they look like a spider. It was later on when we had things like Odyssey and Antares and Orion and Endeavor, and these guys have a lot better imagination than I did. But I don't want to leave you without talking about that last picture, because we also set a first in recovery. On Gemini 4, after we splashed down into the water, in those days we had a thing looked like a horse collar. It's a big yellow thing. You sort of stuck your arms in it, and when the helicopter lowered it to you, and then he pulled you up into the helicopter. And when they got Ed, he got into the thing, and they threw him out into the water and dunked him a few times over the helicopter, or over the spacecraft into the water. And then they pulled him up. And then he came and got me, and we did the same thing, except they swung me out a long way to get a good head start. Bounced me off the heat shield, over I went into the water, and then they trolled for sharks for a few minutes. And anyway, I was rescued. That means I got home in one piece. Well, up until Apollo 9, they'd never televised the recovery. And the helicopter squadron that was out in the Pacific or Atlantic, wherever I came down, had been one of those oceans, they're all the same. They'd been training for a long time on how to make a pickup. Well, it turned out that they really knew how. But on recovery day, their squadron commander thought he ought to be the star, so he went out to do it. He hadn't practiced. And in those days, the way you kept the spacecraft from floating around in the water when the helicopter was blowing air on it was to put a sea anchor out. We had a small sea anchor. We had a lot bigger sea anchor after Apollo 9. Anyway, the helicopter came out, and every time he'd get close to the spacecraft, the downwash off the helicopter would blow the spacecraft away. So he chased us around for about 15 minutes before he even got close. And by then they had changed the pickup from the horse collar to a thing called the Billy Pugh net, which had an aluminum frame, had aluminum about this big around, rod about that long, and it came up in a big hoop, and there's some other pieces in the back. So all you had to do was throw yourself into this net, and they'd pull you up. Well, they finally got close enough where we could get Rusty into it. They did the same thing that we did on Gemini 4, and I thought that was just a standard Navy rescue procedure. You never recover a dirty astronaut. Yeah. So anyway, they got Rusty up, and about 15 minutes later, they finally got Dave up, but they tried something really new and innovative, I thought, that they reeled him up very quick And they forgot that you're supposed to get the Billy Pugh net out from underneath the helicopter, so when he got to the bottom of the helicopter, they nearly knocked him out by hitting his head on the bottom of the helicopter. And then they came back to get me. You see in that picture there, there's only one life raft, but in reality there were 3 life rafts there, and there'd been a scuba guy who had been taking some pictures, and he'd run out of film, and he'd opened up his camera, and he was taking the film out, and so he wasn't watching what was going on, and the Billy Pugh nut came and hit him in the back of the neck and knocked him out. He fell over backwards into the water, and he was stuck with his feet in the life raft and his head underwater, and he was drowning. But everybody was interested in me not getting wet or something, so finally I had to go back and rescue the guy. That's not a joke. Well, anyway, that night they relieved the squadron commander, and we improved the way that we did recoveries. I think that takes care of the highlights of Apollo 9, except we did have a really nice lunar rendezvous, and we proved that the lunar module would work, and we were then ready for the big rehearsal, the thing that was really going to prove out whether or not we could get to the moon and land properly. That mission was called the F mission, Apollo 10, Gene Cernan.
I'd like to say 2 things, Frank. I'm glad to hear your side of Apollo 8. I've heard Lovell and Anders discuss Apollo 8 for a long time, and now I really know what happened. The other thing, Jim, you've got to understand that you and Frank are both Air Force officers, and the Navy needed a lot of training, and I'm not sure that it wasn't planned that way, because for the rest of us, I think it worked out pretty well. I'd just like to take a few minutes here that I have, and first of all, additionally welcome all of you. I know we have a lot of guests, but I also know we have a lot of folks here at JSC. It's good to be around friends that made it happen. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. You, as Frank indicated, we're simply the tip of the arrow, and we get the visibility and perhaps more credit than is deserved, but we got to the moon and we got back safely. We were able to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish because of folks that were here at JSC and throughout this country and industry and the universities that were supporting our efforts. And I'd like to thank those of you who are still here, and for those of you who are what I might classify young Turks, 25, 30 years old, probably were 5, 8, 10, 12 years old when these missions that we're talking about occurred. Utilize this week to look back in history and utilize it to challenge yourself as to what you and this country can do when we really want to do something that's important. The door's been open. I think we truly have opened a vision and an opportunity to the future, but it's going to take an awful lot of an effort, an awful lot of dedication. I heard Dr. Guru say if we had to go to the moon today, he's not sure it wouldn't take twice as long. I don't think it should. I think we've got the same kind of talent, the same kind of people, and the same kind of dedication. Learn from those who went before you, because they did an unquestionably superb job to get the job done. And I can only say on behalf of all of us here and all of us who are not here who had this opportunity, I really sincerely thank you. Let me show just a couple slides, because you're going to see me again at the end of the line. But I've got a couple slides on Apollo 10, and this was a crew of Apollo 10. Tom Stafford in the middle, John Young, that handsome young-looking guy at the right-hand side of the screen, is at the right-hand side of this podium over there. And if you think 20 years hasn't taken its toll, just and I don't know where Jim McDivitt got his gray hair, but when you fly with Tom Stafford twice, you deserve gray hair, I want to promise you. And flying with John is, those of you who know John or who know of him or have worked with him, is probably the greatest thrill a human being can have in space flight, particularly going to the moon together. We did have a good time. We also designed a patch, Apollo 10 patch. It was a little mechanical, if I can have the next slide. And in those early days, both the names of the spacecraft and our patches were sort of indicative of the mechanics of what we were doing. I think we got more philosophical later in the missions when we realized, when we really had a chance to reflect on the kind of pictures that Frank and his crew brought back and began to think about where we were going and what we might see. But Apollo 10 tried to capture, I think it was done by an engineer, tried to capture everything at once. We were going to leave the Earth, we were going to rendezvous, or we're going to go to the moon, rendezvous around the moon. We're going to find a lunar lem coming from somewhere which didn't quite get close enough to the surface to land. But anyway, that was our Apollo 10 patch. Let me go very quickly into a little bit of the background of how we eventually got to the moon on Apollo 10. We were originally the backup crew for Apollo 1, Tom Stafford, John Young, and myself, and we're conducting a similar test out at Downey in an altitude chamber that the crew of Apollo 1 was conducting at the pad at Kennedy when the fire occurred. And obviously it was quite a shock, but as you all know, and with the help of a great many people, we were able as a nation to recover from that shock. Even though we were assigned to that backup crew, things changed drastically after that, and they continued to change. The A, D, E, F, I don't even remember all those numbers and all those missions to the moon anymore. But just because you were on a backup crew, or just because you were assigned to one particular mission, there was never a guarantee that you were going to rotate or get assigned to another mission. So after Apollo, our backup on Apollo 1, we did continue to back up the first Apollo mission. We backed up Wally Schirra and his crew on Apollo 7. And fortunately, we then rotated to Apollo 10. We weren't sure what the mission of Apollo 10 was really going to be. It changed a number of times. We intended to have a lunar module. As Frank indicated to you, when they went to the moon without a lunar module, it sort of shifted things around a great deal. They took a tremendous risk, as we saw from